There's a kind of discomfort that doesn't show up on exams and doesn't have a clear name. It lives in the spaces between daily tasks, in the silence between one appointment and the next, in the kind of tiredness that isn't physical, and in the restlessness that remains even when everything seems fine on the surface. Have you ever felt that even with all the information available, even understanding deep concepts about yourself, something still doesn't feel right? It's like we know just enough to notice what's wrong, but not enough to actually change it. This discomfort doesn't come from the world. It comes from the way we relate to the world. It's a quiet reaction, almost unnoticeable, to the present moment, a kind of resistance that has become so automatic we don't even realize it's there. And still, it drives our mind, our emotions, and even the smallest daily decisions. But think about that. Is the problem really in the situations, or in the way we keep trying to control, interpret, and label them? What if the root of suffering isn't in the facts themselves, but in the filter through which you see them? A filter built by the mind, reinforced by the habit of judging, and held up by almost complete identification with thought. We're used to fixing things, doing, correcting, adjusting. But there's another path, less visible, less talked about, and for that reason, more transformative. A path that isn't built through effort, but through perception. And it begins with something many people find uncomfortable: doing nothing. Yes, there's a point where silence becomes more powerful than any thought. A state where you simply observe, without reacting, where the present moment stops being a problem and becomes a doorway. That's when true presence happens, not as a technique, but as a shift in perspective, a new way of seeing everything you've always lived. The mind usually searches for explanations, but peace shows up when the need to understand loses its power. Suffering gets lighter when the now stops being fought, and the meaning of life starts to appear when you simply allow this moment to exist without trying to change it all the time. Maybe what's still causing pain isn't life itself, but the constant effort to turn it into something different from what it already is. This isn't an invitation to think more. It's an invitation to notice better. And maybe, throughout this journey, you'll realize the answer you've been looking for was never far away. It was always here. It just wasn't being heard. Much of what we call reality isn't reality itself, but an interpretation. We don't see events as they are. We see them as we think they are. The mind doesn't just observe, it builds. It creates stories, labels, compares, projects. And little by little, what was just a thought becomes a filter, and that filter starts shaping everything we perceive. Your perception of reality is filtered by memories, ideas, beliefs, expectations. What we see isn't only what's in front of us, but also what the mind projects onto the experience. And this projection, which happens so automatically, ends up defining how we feel, how we react, and even how we remember what we've lived. That's the point where thinking starts replacing life. The direct, simple, concrete experience of the moment gets traded for a flood of automatic judgments, assumptions, and expectations. What was meant to be lived is analyzed. What was meant to be felt is turned into mental evaluation. And without realizing it, we stop experiencing reality and start just thinking about it. The mind is incredibly powerful, but the same power that helps us create solutions, develop ideas, make decisions, and protect our body's integrity can also become an obstacle, a noise, a barrier between us and the pure reality of the moment. When we think too much, we stop seeing. When we interpret too much, we stop feeling. And so, the direct experience of life slowly gets replaced by layers of thought, layers that, over time, become our personal reality. Have you noticed that most of your worries aren't actually happening right now, but are being built inside your head? The mind projects future scenarios, replays things from the past, invents conversations that never happened. And even knowing this, we still react to these constructions as if they were real, as if they were real threats needing defense, control, and constant effort. That's where conflict begins, not between you and the world, but between what's happening and what the mind believes should be happening. If something is different from what we expected, we judge. If something is uncertain, we project. If something hurts us, we build stories that reinforce the pain. And in doing so, we drift away from the living experience of the present and take refuge in a sort of parallel reality created by thought. This constant misalignment between what's real and what's imagined drains our vital energy. It creates tension, fear, anxiety, and still, we stay attached to this mental activity as if it were the only way to exist. The mind has an undeniable functional role. It organizes, calculates, plans, protects. But when it takes full control, when there's no longer space between the thought and the one who observes it, what was once a tool turns into a prison. And the more you identify with this constant mental activity, the farther you get from the simplicity of the now, from what's happening outside the realm of ideas. The mind itself isn't the problem. It's an essential tool, but only when it's serving consciousness, not when it completely controls it. When the mind dominates the entire field of perception, it starts running on autopilot, creating reaction patterns we don't even question. We judge people before we know them. We react to situations before we understand them. And all of this becomes so habitual that we no longer notice we're living inside a repetitive cycle of interpretation and reaction. There's a fundamental difference between thinking and being conscious, a difference that's not always clear because we've been conditioned to confuse presence with mental activity. But being present isn't about thinking with more focus. It's about perceiving what's here before the mind turns it into a concept. It's about living reality before it gets translated into words. Being conscious isn't the same as thinking. That distinction is essential. Thinking is processing information. Being conscious is noticing, feeling. It's experiencing the now through your senses, not just through your ideas. This consciousness that exists before thought doesn't require effort, doesn't demand logical understanding, and can't be fully explained. But it can be recognized. And once it's recognized, something inside us starts to shift, no longer centered in the mental noise, but in the silent space from where that noise can be observed. When thoughts no longer take up all the inner space, something subtle begins to emerge. It's not an extraordinary feeling or a mystical experience. It's something much simpler, and that's what makes it so powerful. It's presence. The ability to be exactly where you are without trying to change, analyze, or predict the next moment. And even though this term is often used, it's not always understood in its true essence. Presence is not a passive state or a concentration technique. It's a mode of perception where reality is seen as it is, before any judgment or interpretation. It's seeing something without labeling it, listening without anticipating, feeling without resisting. It's as if consciousness steps one step back from the mind and just observes, without needing to interfere. Presence is consciousness in its purest state. It isn't tied to ideas, emotions, or images. It simply observes. When you are present, there's no need to explain what you feel. There's no urgency to judge what you see. There is a quiet acceptance of the moment just as it is, without filters and without trying to fix or change anything. And that's exactly why pain loses its strength in this state. Psychological pain needs narratives to survive. It needs repetitive thoughts, comparisons to the past, projections of the future. But when you are completely present, those narratives lose the space they used to develop in. When your attention is in the now, the automatic reaction cycle breaks. Suffering, which depends on identification with thought, loses the ground it stands on. Intense emotions might still show up, but presence allows you to feel them without letting them define who you are. The mind becomes quiet, and in that silence, the pain that once felt overwhelming finds a natural limit. It stops growing because it stops being fed, and that alone creates deep effects. Have you ever felt peace for no particular reason, just by being fully there, in the moment? Not because everything was perfect, but because, for a brief instant, there was no effort, no judgment, just life unfolding, and you in it, not separate, not in conflict, but whole. That kind of peace isn't something you create. It's revealed when the mental noise fades away. It's the natural state of consciousness when it's not being used to compare, remember, or anticipate. That's presence, the quiet recognition that now is enough. Not as a thought, but as a direct experience. But being present is not the same as being focused. Focused attention can be fragmented, directed to a task, used as a tool. Presence is broader. It's a state where everything is perceived at once, without needing to cling to or reject anything. It's an open internal space, where even discomfort can exist without turning into long-lasting pain. And when that space is truly accessed, even for just a few seconds, something changes. The urgency fades. The internal rigidity begins to soften. Perception is no longer driven by mental impulses and starts to stabilize in something deeper, quieter, more real. Being present doesn't mean stopping thought. It means not getting lost in it. It means noticing when the mind starts narrating and choosing not to follow it blindly. It's a state of open observation where even thought can exist, but it's seen as something happening, not something that defines who you are. And this observation changes everything. It interrupts patterns, calms the body, dissolves resistance. Presence doesn't demand effort, but it does require willingness. Willingness to pause, to listen to the now more deeply than the mind is used to let sensations be felt without labeling them, to see what's in front of your eyes as if it were the first time, because, in truth, it is. And every time you choose to be present, even briefly, you take a step closer to life as it actually is, not as you think it should be. But what exactly prevents us from remaining in this state? Why does this presence feel so close and yet so distant? Even after understanding that the present moment is all that exists, we still feel a kind of constant tension inside. A restlessness that doesn't come from the environment or other people, but seems to arise automatically, almost like a built-in defense mechanism. That restlessness is what we might call internal resistance. It shows up every time something happens, and even before we fully understand what's happening, we already react with judgment, rejection, or discomfort. It's as if the mind were programmed not to allow things to just be as they are. There's always an opinion, an impulse, a desire for things to be different than they are. And this ongoing opposition to what is happening doesn't seem unusual until we notice how much it drains us, weighs us down, and disconnects us from life. Resistance often arises unconsciously, from the belief that if something doesn't meet the ego's expectations, it must be fought or avoided. And this fight is not always visible. It happens inside, in mental narratives, in inner dialogues, in frustration, in emotional denial. We resist people who don't behave as we'd like. We resist feelings we don't want to feel. We resist circumstances we can't control. We even resist silence, waiting, the simplicity of now. This reflex of opposition creates tension, and when that tension lasts long enough, it turns into suffering. Not because situations are unbearable, but because the effort to fight them consumes us from the inside out. It's a constant drain, often invisible, that affects not only our energy but also how we perceive reality. But why do we feel the need to fight what's already happening? What part of us believes that resisting the present will somehow change what already is? That's the trap. We believe that resisting gives us control, but in reality, it only deepens the discomfort. This is where acceptance comes in. In this context, acceptance is not passivity. It's not closing your eyes to pain or pretending everything is fine. Acceptance is simply stopping the fight with what is. It's recognizing that the present moment is already in motion, and that judgment doesn't stop it, it only separates us from it. Acceptance removes the inner friction, that subtle tension constantly saying, "This shouldn't be happening." When that friction fades, even if just for a moment, something powerful happens. The content of the experience might remain the same. The external situation might not have changed, but the internal relationship with the experience transforms. And that shift in relationship begins to dissolve the emotional weight of what once felt unbearable. That's often when a deeper understanding begins to emerge. Suffering doesn't come from pain itself, but from resistance to pain. Discomfort isn't just in the situation, it's in the mental struggle against it. And paradoxically, the moment we stop trying to control everything, clarity begins to rise, not as a logical conclusion, but as an internal realization. This clarity isn't born from effort. It appears when the mind stops demanding that everything fit its patterns and starts seeing reality with more neutrality. Acceptance, in that sense, doesn't erase pain, but it softens it. It allows it to move through you without leaving deep marks behind. Still, there's something that makes this surrender so difficult for many people. An inner force that insists on keeping control, defending an identity, protecting something that might not even have a clear shape. And this is where an unavoidable question arises. Who exactly is resisting? There's a part inside us that seems to react to everything, to what we see, to what we hear, to what we feel. A voice that constantly comments, interprets, judges, compares, analyzes. It's this voice we call self. But what exactly is this self that's always narrating reality? Who is this self that always seems to have something to say about everything? Most of the time, we believe we are this voice, this mental stream. We think this inner narrator is who we truly are. It doesn't just speak, it tells stories. Stories about who we are, what we've done, what we could have done, what we should feel. And over the years, those stories build up into an identity, a self made from memories, desires, traumas, fears, and opinions. But is that really who we are? This self is, in truth, a mental structure that needs conflict in order to keep existing. It grows stronger when it feels offended, when it finds something to fix, when it feels it needs to defend itself. It depends on resistance, comparison, and judgment. Without those elements, it loses its role, and over time, it loses its strength. The ego, in that sense, isn't an enemy. It's a creation, a layer of thought developed to help us function in the world, but one that ended up dominating the field of consciousness. It convinces us that we are the emotions we feel, the thoughts we think, the roles we play. But those things are changeable, temporary, and anything that changes, by definition, cannot be the essence of who we are. The point is, this thinking self can only survive as long as there is total identification with the mind's content. But when the awareness arises that thoughts are just thoughts and that they can be observed, something shifts. A subtle separation happens. Observation starts to take the place of identification, and it's in that space, the space between the thought and the one who observes it, that true freedom begins to appear. Have you ever watched your own thoughts as if they weren't yours? Have you noticed, for instance, how some ideas simply show up without you inviting them? They appear, unfold, and often vanish without leaving a trace. And even so, we often react to them as if they were commands, as if every idea that arises deserves our attention, our belief, our obedience. The realization that thought can be observed, and that there is something conscious beyond it, is the beginning of the ego's dissolution. Because the ego cannot survive under the light of consciousness. It needs reactivity, urgency, noise. But when you slow down, when you simply observe without resisting or identifying, a new dimension opens up. This new dimension has no name, no shape, no clear definition, but it is perceptible. It's a state where there's silence without emptiness, perception without judgment, presence without effort. In this state, the self that used to react to everything begins to dissolve, and what remains is not an absence, but a broader presence, free from the chains of stories, roles, and defenses. It's at this point that a new way of being in the world begins to emerge, a way that doesn't depend on mental effort or the constant need to take a stand, something deeper, more stable, more real, something that doesn't need to say, "I am," because it simply is. But if we're not this stream of thoughts, and we're not this character the mind builds, then who is aware of all of this? When the mental construction we call self starts to dissolve, the space that was once occupied by inner voices begins to expand. And what arises in that space is not a formless void, it's silence, but not the silence of no sound. It's a living, conscious silence that doesn't need to be filled to be meaningful. Contrary to what many people think, this state of stillness isn't a blank, it's a revelation. The restless mind is always chasing answers. It questions, analyzes, projects, compares, all in the hope of finding some kind of safety or control. But the more the mind tries to figure everything out, the further it gets from the place where true answers can actually appear. Because there's a limit to what thought can understand. And that limit is crossed not through more thinking, but through the space between thoughts. It's in the inner silence that the deepest understanding happens, a kind of knowing that doesn't come from logic, but from direct perception of reality. It's not about reaching conclusions, it's about seeing with clarity. It's as if, when the noise stops, life itself begins to speak, not through words, but through a presence that delivers meaning effortlessly, a type of intelligence that isn't tied to thinking, but that exists before it. This intelligence doesn't need effort to operate. It doesn't respond to commands, nor does it follow fixed rules. It flows. And when you are present, not just focused, but truly grounded in the now, this intelligence begins to express itself naturally through you. The way you act changes. Words come with more clarity. Decisions stop being impulsive and start reflecting something more coherent, more connected to the whole. Have you ever noticed the space between one thought and the next? Not the content, but the gap between them. Have you noticed that brief pause where there's no word in your mind, yet something remains conscious? That gap is where silence lives. That's where consciousness returns to itself, and in that silence lies the source of true clarity. Reaction is the automatic movement of the conditioned mind, but response is the gesture that arises from silence. Reaction carries urgency, judgment, and defense. Response, on the other hand, comes with balance, as if it were aligned with something greater. This difference is subtle, but it completely transforms the quality of our actions. The mind can be sharp, but without silence it becomes excessive. And everything that's excessive obscures. Life doesn't require us to constantly interpret, explain, or predict. Many situations we face become lighter not because they changed, but because we stopped approaching them with the mind's urgency and began seeing them with the clarity of silence. It's in this state that wisdom shows up, not as theory, but as intuitive, simple, and precise direction. This silence doesn't need to be forced or manufactured. It's already here. It always has been. The problem is that we've become so used to the noise, we've forgotten what it's like to exist without it. But the memory remains. Somewhere inside, we all know what this state feels like. A moment when everything seems to be in its place, without effort, without pressure, without noise, an instant where nothing needs to be said, because everything is already understood. But what exactly keeps us away from that silence, even when we know it's always available? There's a deep difference between living with attention and living with tension. Tension is born from the constant attempt to control what isn't in our hands. We try to shape the world to our liking, to mold people to our expectations, to prevent pain, to rush what we want, and to avoid what we fear. And yet, life goes on with its own rhythm, indifferent to the mind's demands. In this effort to control, the ego assumes that everything that doesn't match its plan is a threat, and when that happens, frustration, anxiety, and the feeling that something is always wrong show up. But what is actually wrong? Reality, or the expectation that it should behave the way we imagined. That's where surrender is born. Surrender is not a sign of weakness. It's the release of the illusion that we need to control everything in order to be at peace. To surrender is to recognize that there's a broader intelligence than our plans, an intelligence that's already operating, even when we think we're in charge. To surrender is to leave the position of the one demanding answers and become the one who observes with openness. True trust isn't born from having all the answers, but from being able to remain present even when the answers don't show up. When you stop demanding that everything satisfy the ego's desires, something quiet begins to happen. The body relaxes, the mind slows down. Decisions no longer come from anxiety, but from a clarity that arises naturally, without pressure. What once felt forced becomes fluid. What once felt heavy becomes light. And what used to be conflict gives way to a lucid acceptance of what is. This acceptance doesn't mean giving up or being passive in life. Quite the opposite. When there's true acceptance, action is no longer reactive. It becomes more precise, more conscious, more free of inner noise. There's less need to prove something, and more sensitivity to understand what truly needs to be done or not done. Life starts to flow with greater harmony, not because everything has changed, but because you're no longer fighting every detail that didn't go as expected. Have you ever considered the possibility that what you call a problem is exactly what needs to happen for something to align within you? Sometimes, what seems like an obstacle is just the interruption of a pattern that no longer serves you. And the pain doesn't come from the event itself, but from the resistance to the adjustment that's trying to happen. Surrender allows that realignment to unfold. When we stop trying to control every part of the process, we open space for life itself to show us a path, one that logic alone could never reveal. But this surrender isn't a one-time act. It's a relaxed state of awareness, an inner willingness to stop fighting the natural flow of life. And when that willingness becomes stable, something inside quiets down. What once felt dependent on control begins to function more smoothly than we ever could have achieved through effort. But for this to happen, the old mental structure that insists on leading everything must be released. So what happens when that structure finally falls apart? What remains when control is no longer the center? There's a kind of peace that doesn't come from something happening. It doesn't show up because everything is finally in place. It doesn't depend on ideal conditions. This peace is silent, constant, and deeply stable. It doesn't oppose chaos, and it doesn't require external calm to exist. Its origin isn't in the world. It's in the inner state of someone who has stopped fighting reality. When we let go of the need for life to match the mind's expectations, the tension that follows us begins to dissolve. And in that release, a state of presence begins to emerge, one that doesn't need to be maintained because it's already there, simply waiting to be recognized. Consciousness pulls back from the effort of interpreting, controlling, and resisting, and anchors itself in what's happening now, exactly as it is. And in that quiet shift, everything starts to make sense, not because we've figured it out, but because we've finally stopped trying. True peace isn't something extraordinary. It's a return to what's essential, to what has always been available, but was hidden by the mental noise. It isn't earned through effort or taught through techniques. It reveals itself when thought stops taking center stage, and consciousness returns to its rightful place, the present. In that state, each experience becomes enough on its own. There's no longer a need for something to be different. What arrives is welcomed. What leaves is released. And the mind, free from the burden of controlling everything, becomes lighter, more lucid, quieter. Time slows down. Urgency fades. And with that, the quality of perception transforms. You begin to see more deeply, feel more fully, and live more truthfully. Accepting the now is more than a choice. It's an internal realignment. And that realignment dissolves the roots of suffering, not because it removes all difficulty, but because it ends the cycle of resistance that used to amplify it. Life, once lived through the lens of thought, returns to being lived directly, without filters, without distortion, just lived. And perhaps the most revealing part of all this is realizing that this peace can't be explained. It doesn't fit into definitions. It can't be reduced to words, because it's not a concept. It's a state of being, a state that doesn't depend on changing anything outside, but on no longer trying to change everything all the time. True transformation begins when we stop running from where we are, when we stop fighting what we feel, when we realize that behind all the effort there's a stillness that never left us. And when we return to that place, we finally discover that what we were looking for out there was always right here, within. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.